Tomorrow you are allowed to attend your brother's engagement party. But on one condition, keep your mouth shut. Keep your mouth shut and do not embarrass this family with your military nonsense the way you always do." That was the exact sentence my biological father threw in my face at 2 in the morning. He forced me to deny 14 years of blood, sweat, and survival, to strip off my captain's uniform in exchange for a seat at the corner of a dinner table. The reason he wanted to suck up to the bride's family, specifically a retired United States Army colonel. But what he did not know was that the colonel he was so frantically trying to impress was the exact same man who personally pinned a medal on my chest 3 years ago. He did not know because he never bothered to ask. What happened at that dinner table is the reason I am telling you this story today. I am Ellen Morin. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. But only if this story makes you feel something. And let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there right now, 2:07 in the morning. Beep, beep, beep. The automated sound of a disconnected line repeated in my ear. Steady, hollow, relentless. Lawrence always hung up first. He delivered his orders and he cut the line. That was how he operated. I did not scream. I did not throw the device against the wall. A soldier who has managed to survive the relentless mortar fire of Helmand Province does not get the luxury of a jumpy nervous system. I slowly lowered the phone. The plastic casing was burning hot against my cheek, a stark contrast to the absolute freeze settling in my chest. I placed the phone on the cheap faux wood desk of this Holiday Inn. Roanoke, Virginia, was completely dead at this hour. Outside the window, a single street lamp flickered over an empty asphalt parking lot. The silence in this room was heavy. It was suffocating. Tonight, this quiet felt far more brutal than any artillery barrage I ever faced overseas. Because an enemy shoots at you from the front. Family stabs you quietly, right where you sleep. I walked over to the edge of the mattress and sat down. The cheap metal springs groaned under my weight. I twisted my torso, feeling the familiar, rigid pop of my spine. "Do not embarrass this family the way you always do." The words echoed in the stale, air-conditioned air of the room. That sentence was not a random flare-up of anger. It was a calculated verdict. A label my father has categorized, filed, and weaponized against me for the past 14 years. I reached my right hand across my chest and traced my collarbone, my fingers, finding the thick, faded ridge of scar tissue on my shoulder. Shrapnel. A brutal physical reminder of the dirt and blood I left in a foreign desert. I spent a decade and a half building supply lines, moving thousands of gallons of fuel, and keeping American troops alive under hellish conditions. I bled for this country. I earned my rank through pure grit and shattered bones. Yet here I was. I could not even buy a single ounce of basic human respect to secure a proper seat at my own family's dinner table. To my biological father, my entire existence, my uniform, my survival, it was all just a dirty secret. A stain he needed to scrub clean before he presented his perfect golden child to the wealthy future in-laws. I pushed myself off the bed and walked toward the open closet. The hinges were rusted, exposing the dark, narrow space inside. Hanging right in the center were two completely different versions of my life. On the right side hung a black dress. It was a cheap, flimsy piece of synthetic fabric I grabbed off a clearance rack at a local strip mall just hours ago. No shape, no character. On the left side hung my uniform, the Army dress blues. It was sharp, impeccable. The brass buttons caught the dim yellow light of the bedside lamp. The captain's shoulder board sat broad and heavy, demanding respect. The ribbons on the chest told a story of survival, leadership, and hell on earth. These were the two identities. Lawrence wanted me to shove the uniform into the dark corner. He wanted to strip away the commissioned officer, erase every trace of my authority, and force me to wear the cheap black fabric of a nameless, unemployed failure. Why? Because a strong, decorated daughter is a direct threat to his absolute control. He needed me to be a nobody, so my cowardly younger brother Kyle could look like a massive success tomorrow night. My hand reached out, brushing past the dark silk of the civilian dress. My fingers slipped deep into the pocket of the uniform jacket. I found what I was looking for: the challenge coin. It was a heavy piece of solid metal. It was ice cold against my fingertips, instantly grounding me. I ran my thumb over the raised edges, feeling the battalion insignia stamped deep into the steel. The retired colonel. The man Lawrence was currently losing his mind trying to impress. My father did not know who Robert Miller was. He just saw a fat pension and a country club status. He had no idea about the dirt on Robert's combat boots, and he certainly had no idea that Robert Miller was the exact same commander who looked me dead in the eye and pinned a commendation medal on my chest. I stood alone in the cheap hotel room and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold mechanical stretch of lips from someone who realizes they are holding a lit match over a massive pool of gasoline. I pulled my hand out of the pocket, leaving the coin inside. I grabbed the metal tab of the black nylon garment bag hanging over the uniform. It was time to hide the soldier. For now. I pulled the zipper up. The sound was a harsh, dry, grinding screech. It echoed violently in the dead, quiet room. I closed my eyes and the sound instantly warped. It morphed. It stretched into the sharp, violent noise of thick paper being torn apart. It was the exact same sound of my military enlistment contract being ripped to shreds on the cold stainless steel prep table in Lawrence's kitchen 14 long years ago. The harsh screech of the nylon zipper warped in my mind. It stretched and snapped, transforming into the violent sound of thick paper being ripped in half. 14 years ago, Brambleton Avenue. I was standing in the back of the cinder block building my father rented for his catering business. The air inside that commercial kitchen was heavy. It was a thick, greasy fog of slow-roasted pork shoulder, cheap apple cider vinegar, and burnt brown sugar. The industrial exhaust fan above the massive stoves rattled with a constant grinding metal noise that ate directly into your skull. The walls were coated in a permanent film of yellow grease. My mother died right on that sticky linoleum floor. Massive coronary at the age of 51. She dropped dead with a tray of baked ziti in her hands. For the average man, losing a wife of 20 years would be a devastating blow. For Lawrence Morin, it was a logistical nightmare. In his eyes, he did not lose a life partner. He lost his most reliable, unpaid prep cook. 2 years had passed since her funeral, and he still complained about being short-staffed. I was 18. I stood across from him at the main prep station. I reached into my backpack, pulled out a manila envelope, and slid my military enlistment contract onto the freezing cold stainless steel table. Lawrence was breaking down a pork shoulder. He gripped a heavy meat cleaver. Whack! Whack! He drove the heavy steel through bone and gristle with practiced aggression. Then he saw the official Army seal on the top of the paper. The cleaver stopped in midair. He lowered it slowly. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray under the harsh fluorescent tube lights. He did not look at me with concern. He looked at me the way a factory boss looks at a piece of expensive machinery that just caught fire. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" he hissed. His voice was low, scraping the bottom of his throat. I kept my spine perfectly straight. I locked my knees. It was a stance I would later perfect in front of drill sergeants, but I was already practicing it here in the grease and the heat. "I leave for basic training in 3 weeks," I said. My voice did not shake. "I am building my own foundation, something no one in this kitchen can ever take away from me." He did not hear a word about my foundation. He did not care about my future. He lunged forward, his massive hands grabbing the contract. "I put food in your mouth so you could work this kitchen," he roared, slamming his fist down on the metal table. The stainless steel vibrated violently. "You think you get to just walk out? Who is going to haul the freezer stock? Who is going to load the vans? I raised you to stay right here." He did not want a daughter in uniform. He did not want a hero. He wanted a pack mule. He wanted a free laborer to haul 50-pound boxes of frozen meat until my spine gave out, just like my mother's heart did. The heavy metal door at the back of the kitchen creaked open. Kyle walked in. He was 14 at the time, skinny, pale, and constantly nervous. He took one look at our father's red face, the meat cleaver resting on the table, and he immediately cowered. He shrank his shoulders, making himself as physically small as possible. He did not say a word. He quietly pulled a plastic milk crate up to the sink, grabbed a bucket of raw yellow onions, and started peeling them. He kept his head down, staring blindly at the drain. Lawrence snatched a long, thin, boning knife off the rack and pointed the tip of the blade directly at Kyle's hunched back. Look at your brother. Lawrence spat his eyes locked on mine with pure disgust. Look at him. He actually gives a damn about this family. He knows where his loyalty belongs. What brings so's, that was the twisted, toxic mathematics of the Morin household. I stood there and finally understood the formula. If you kept your mouth shut, let him exploit your labor, and lived in constant fear of his temper, you were rewarded with the title of a good, loyal child. But the second you tried to stand on your own 2 feet, the second you demanded a life of your own, you were a traitor. You were ungrateful garbage, I did not argue. You cannot negotiate with a man who views you as property. I simply took my torn contract back, taped it together that night, and packed my duffel bag. 3 weeks later, 6 o'clock in the morning. The Virginia fog was thick gray and freezing cold. The damp air smelled like wet asphalt and the heavy exhaust of the Ford Crown Victoria taxi idling at the curb. I stood in the driveway with a single green canvas bag over my shoulder. Lawrence stood on the wooden planks of the front porch. He wore a stained gray bathrobe hanging loose and sloppy around his waist. He held a ceramic coffee mug. He did not walk down the steps. He did not offer a hug. He did not tell me to keep my head down or stay safe. He just stared at me with cold, dead eyes. You walk out that door, he said, his voice cutting clearly through the morning mist. Do not expect me to be waiting for you when you fail. I turned my back on him. I grabbed the metal handle of the taxi door, slid onto the cracked leather seat, and pulled the door shut. Slam. If you have ever had to walk away from your own family just to protect your sanity, I know exactly how heavy that door feels. Take a second right now to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below saying, I walked away. Let me know I am not the only one who had to choose my own survival over toxic loyalty. The heavy sound of that taxi door slamming shut instantly dissolved. The damp fog of Virginia vanished. The piercing, high-pitched ringing of an electronic alarm clock shattered the silence. I blinked. The cheap walls of the Roanoke Holiday Inn came back into focus. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. The glowing red numbers read exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, present day. I reached out and hit the off button. The silence rushed back in. My lungs filled with the sterile air of the hotel room. The memories were gone. The real war was starting today. 6:15 in the morning. I rolled off the sagging mattress. My bare feet hit the floor. The carpet in this cheap Roanoke hotel felt rough, synthetic, and coated in a thin layer of permanent dirt. The room smelled like stale air conditioning and decades of old cigarette smoke baked deep into the drywall. I did not lie in bed. I did not stare at the ceiling and cry about my father. Tears are a useless currency. I dropped to the floor, palms flat against the scratchy carpet, back straight, shoulders locked, core tight. I started pushing. 1, 2, 3. I pushed a steady, punishing rhythm. I let the physical strain override the mental noise. My breath hissed through my teeth. Sweat began to bead on my forehead, stinging my eyes. 48, 49, 50. I dropped onto my forearms and held a plank. The muscles in my upper back burned, pulling tightly around the jagged shrapnel scar near my right collarbone. Pain is just data. It tells you that you are still breathing. Discipline is the only anchor I have left. It is the absolute only thing keeping the toxic gravity of the Morin family from dragging me straight down to the bottom of the river. I stood up, ignoring the sharp pop in my knees. I walked over to the bathroom counter and hit the switch on the cheap plastic coffee maker. It sputtered violently. It coughed out a thin, dark stream of boiling water into a paper cup. I took a sip. It was bitter, acidic, and completely black. It tasted like battery acid, but it did the job. It stripped the last bit of fog from my brain. By 7 o'clock, I was a captain again. I sat at the small glass-topped desk in the corner of the room, my laptop screen glowing in the dim morning light. I dialed a secure line to the logistics command back at Fort Campbell. Give me the numbers on the JP-8 fuel reserves, I said into the receiver. My voice was flat, mechanical, authoritative. I listened to the young lieutenant on the other end rattle off the supply manifest for the upcoming field training rotation. I pulled up a spreadsheet, my eyes scanning the columns of data. Double the water pallets for Charlie Company. I ordered, cutting him off mid-sentence. It is going to hit 95 degrees out there on the range by noon. I do not want a single private dropping from heat exhaustion on my watch. Adjust the motor pool schedule and get it done. Yes, ma'am, he replied instantly. I hung up the phone. I stared at the blank wall behind the laptop. 14 years. I spent 14 years building this career from the dirt up. 3 combat deployments. I ran the main supply routes in Helmand Province. I moved hundreds of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel rations and heavy ammunition through narrow dirt roads rigged with improvised explosives. My job was to keep forward operating bases alive. When a mortar shell hit our compound, blowing out the side of the command tent and ripping my shoulder open, I did not go home. I got stitched up by a combat medic, swallowed a handful of painkillers, and went right back to the radio. I hold the rank of captain in the United States Army. It is an identity carved out of pure survival. It is a title paid for in blood. 8:15 in the morning. The civilian cell phone sitting next to my laptop vibrated. It was a harsh rattling noise that buzzed aggressively against the glass desk. I picked it up. The screen lit up with a text message. It was from Kyle, my 28-year-old spineless brother, the boy who peeled onions while our father screamed at me. I swiped the screen open. Dinner tonight is at 7. The reservation is under Mr. Miller. Dress nice, Ellen, and just sit there and smile. And do me a favor, do not bring up any of that military stuff. It makes people uncomfortable. I read the message twice. My thumb hovered frozen over the glass screen. Military stuff. The muscles in my jaw clenched tight. I gripped the edges of the phone. I squeezed my hand until the plastic casing actually creaked under the pressure. My knuckles turned bone white. My heart rate did not spike. It slowed down into a heavy rhythmic thud inside my chest. Military stuff. To Kyle, my entire life was just a socially awkward hobby. The sweat, the dirt, the sand grinding in my teeth. The deafening, chest-rattling roar of incoming artillery fire. The young 19-year-old kids I watched bleed out on canvas stretchers while waiting for a medevac chopper in the dead of the night. To a civilian who sells life insurance from a climate-controlled office cubicle, all of that was just a tacky topic. A social faux pas. Something dirty that needed to be swept under the rug so he could look classy while eating an expensive steak with his future in-laws. He was perfectly fine with men and women dying in the dirt to protect his right to sit in a fancy restaurant. But God forbid a real soldier actually speaks at his dinner table. 14 years of raw resilience. 14 years of command. He dismissed all of it with one trashy, cowardly text message. I did not type back a long, angry paragraph. I did not try to justify my existence to a man who still hid behind his father's shadow. A soldier does not argue with a coward. I simply hit the power button on the side of the phone. The screen went pitch black. I tossed it onto the unmade bed. Tonight I was going to follow his instructions perfectly. I was going to show up. I was going to dress nice. But I was not going to smile. 10 o'clock in the morning. I was standing by the window of the hotel room, watching a garbage truck empty a dumpster behind a strip mall across the street. The heavy hydraulic whine of the truck filtered through the cheap glass. My phone chimed again. A sharp, cheerful notification sound that did not belong in this room. I picked it up. A new text message. This time it was an unknown number. I opened the thread. Hi, Ellen, it is Sarah. I am so excited to finally meet you tonight. Just a heads up, my dad is pretty traditional, so we are keeping the vibe super light. Kyle mentioned you have been backpacking and doing the freelance travel thing a lot lately. I would love to hear about your trips. See you at 7. I stopped breathing. The air left my lungs in one sudden involuntary rush. Backpacking? Freelance travel thing. I read the words again. The bright pixels on the screen burned into my retinas. They were not just asking me to keep my mouth shut anymore. They were actively erasing me. Kyle and Lawrence had taken 14 years of military service, 3 combat deployments, and my rank as an army captain, and they had scrubbed it clean. They stripped my uniform off my back and dressed me up as some aimless, unemployed drifter. A ghost with no career, no purpose, and no threat to Kyle's fragile ego. My jaw locked. I did not throw the phone. I did not scream. I hit the call button on Kyle's contact name. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, he picked up. "Hey, Elle," Kyle said. His voice was too loud, too fast, the strained, overly casual pitch of a liar who knows he just got caught. "What is up? I'm picking up the suit right now." "You told your fiancé I am a freelancer," I said. My voice was completely flat, zero inflection. I delivered the words like a physical strike. Silence on the line. I could hear the faint hum of traffic in the background. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a coward calculating exactly how much truth he needed to sprinkle over his lie to survive the conversation. "Look," Kyle finally stammered. He dropped the cheerful act. The real Kyle slipped out. Defensive. Pathetic. "You do travel a lot for your thing. It is not exactly a lie." "I deploy to combat zones, Kyle. I command a logistics company." "Yeah, well, her dad is a real Colonel Ellen," he snapped back. The mask completely fell off. The sneer in his voice was unmistakable. "He's old school. He does not want to hear about some woman playing soldier in the dirt. He's not going to humor you." "I just need tonight to go smooth. Okay, I need this to look good." "A real colonel." Kyle threw those words at me like a weapon. He genuinely believed it. He believed my rank was fake. A technicality, a joke. I stood in the center of the hotel room. The irony was so thick it tasted like copper in the back of my throat. 14 years ago, my own father looked at me and told me I was nothing but a free laborer. But 3 years ago, on a sprawling parade field at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, things were different. The sun was blinding. The brass band was playing. I stood at attention, my dress uniform perfectly pressed. A man walked down the line, a real colonel. Broad shoulders, eyes that had seen more death and dirt than Kyle could ever comprehend from his climate-controlled cubicle. That colonel stopped in front of me. He looked me dead in the eye. He did not see a woman playing soldier. He saw an officer who kept hundreds of his men alive by moving fuel and ammo through a war zone. He pinned the Army Commendation Medal onto my chest. He shook my hand. The grip was firm, respectful. The United States Army gave me a father figure who actually saw my worth. My biological bloodline just wanted to bury me alive. "Just please act normal tonight." Kyle said, his voice dropping into a rushed, nervous whisper. "I have to go." Click. The line went dead. I lowered the phone. I set it gently on the edge of the mattress. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger is hot. Anger is reckless. What I felt right now was absolute freezing cold. It was the icy clarity you get right before you pull the trigger. I turned around and walked to the open closet. I bypassed the dress blues uniform, hidden inside the black nylon garment bag. I reached for the civilian dress on the right. It was a cheap, thin silk blend. Black, formless. I pulled it off the plastic hanger. The fabric slipped over my skin, cold and lifeless. I looked in the mirror above the desk. I looked exactly like the ghost they wanted me to be. A shadow. A nobody. I reached back into the closet and slid my hand into the pocket of my uniform jacket. My fingers closed around the solid metal of the challenge coin, the battalion crest, the colonel's coin. I pulled it out. The heavy brass felt grounding in the palm of my hand. I slipped the coin deep into the pocket of the cheap black dress. The metal weight bumped against my thigh. A concealed weapon. I grabbed the hotel room key off the desk. 6:55 in the evening. The heavy mahogany double doors of the pursed grill loomed in front of me. The brass handles were polished. The air outside the restaurant smelled like expensive grilled steak and valet exhaust fumes. I reached out, wrapped my fingers around the cold brass handle, and pulled the door open. 6:55 in the evening. The interior of the pursed grill was dark. The lighting was a moody, dim crimson that bounced off the polished wood paneling. The floor was covered in a thick, dark red velvet carpet that swallowed the sound of my footsteps. I was 5 minutes early. Military discipline is permanently wired into my nervous system. An officer is never late. I walked into the private dining room booked for the engagement dinner. It was a long, narrow space, A heavy oak table sat in the center, set with polished silver and crystal water glasses. Lawrence was already there. He stood near the head of the table. He was wearing a sharp-tailored gray suit that probably cost more than my first car. But no matter how expensive the wool was, he still smelled like cheap mothballs and old aftershave. He turned as I walked in. He did not smile. He did not step forward to hug his daughter. His eyes immediately dropped to my feet and slowly dragged up to the top of my head. It was the exact same heavy, calculating stare of a drill sergeant inspecting a fresh recruit for uniform violations. He was looking for a reason to criticize me. He found none. The cheap black dress fit fine. Well, Lawrence grunted, jutting his chin toward me. At least you learned how to dress yourself this time. That was his version of a greeting. I did not respond. I kept my face blank, my hands loosely folded in front of me. Before the silence could stretch into a fight, the side door opened. Kyle walked in, practically dragging a young blonde woman by the hand. Sarah, the bride-to-be. She walked straight up to me and grabbed my right hand. Her smile was wide, bright, and completely hollow. You must be Ellen, Sarah chirped. I am so glad you could make it. Kyle tells me you are always doing that freelance travel thing. Backpacking around, right? Where did you just get back from? The freelance travel thing. There it was again, said right to my face. The sheer ignorance was like a physical slap. I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide and innocent. She had no idea she was holding a loaded gun. She was just repeating the script Kyle handed her. I looked past her shoulder. Kyle was standing a few feet away, aggressively adjusting his silk tie. He would not make eye contact with me. I forced the corners of my mouth to curl upward, a purely mechanical smile. I have been overseas, I said evenly. I did not correct her. I did not pull out my military ID. I was just going to eat the steak, play the good older sister for 2 hours, and get on a flight back to my base in Kentucky tomorrow morning. But my silence was a massive tactical error. In the Morin family, tolerance is always mistaken for weakness. I turned away from Sarah and reached for the heavy wooden chair on the far side of the table. I wanted to sit down. I wanted to put distance between myself and my father. I never touched the chair. Lawrence closed the gap between us in 2 rapid strides. His massive hand shot out and clamped down hard on my right bicep. The grip was absolute iron. His thick fingernails instantly dug through the thin silk of my dress, pressing painfully into my skin. He did not say a word. He just yanked me backward. He physically dragged me away from the table, out the side door, and into the dim, empty hallway outside the private room. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind us, muffling the jazz music from the main dining floor. The lighting out here was terrible. Just a few flickering wall sconces, casting long, ugly shadows. Lawrence shoved me. He used his body weight to back me up until my shoulder blades hit the wall. The rough, textured wallpaper scraped against my bare arms. He leaned in close. I could smell the stale coffee and peppermint gum on his breath. Listen to me very carefully. He hissed, his voice dropping into a harsh, vibrating whisper. I told them you manage a hotel. You jump from city to city. If they ask you about your job tonight, you nod your head. You agree with them. I stopped breathing. The cold wall pressed against my spine, but the chill spreading through my chest was worse. You told them I manage a hotel, I asked. My voice was a dead, hollow echo in the narrow hallway. He tightened his grip on my arm. Yes, and you will not embarrass me in there. Do you understand? I tried to pull my arm away. His fingers only dug in deeper. I am a quartermaster captain, I said, keeping my voice low but sharp. I run supply lines for 3 forward operating bases under live mortar fire. I am not a hotel manager, Lawrence. He let go of my arm, but he didn't back away. Instead, he raised his hand and swatted the air next to my face, a gesture dripping with absolute, unfiltered disgust. It was the exact same motion you would use to swat away a dirty fly. It is just semantics, he sneered, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive gray suit. Nobody in there cares about your little army stories. Do not open your mouth and correct me in front of Robert Miller. You sit there, you nod, you play along. He turned his back on me and walked to the door. He did not look back. He pushed the heavy wood open and stepped back into the warm red light of the private room. I stood frozen in the dark hallway for exactly 15 seconds. My shoulder burned where he slammed me into the wall. My bicep throbbed where his nails dug in. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological execution that just took place. I was an officer. My orders dictated whether men ate, drank, and had enough ammunition to survive the night. But standing in this dim, carpeted hallway, I was treated like a criminal, like a dirty secret. Every single time I nodded along to his lie tonight, I would be voluntarily holding the eraser. I would be helping my father wipe my own existence off the map. I closed my eyes. I reached my hand into the pocket of my dress. My fingers wrapped tightly around the cold, heavy brass of the challenge coin. I opened my eyes. I pushed myself off the wall. I walked back into the private dining room. I swallowed the massive lump of humiliation blocking my throat and walked toward my chair. Just as my hand touched the wood of the backrest, the main double doors of the room swung open. The heavy brass handle clicked loudly. They were here. The heavy brass door handle clicked open. A deep, steady voice filled the room before the man even stepped fully inside. "Sorry we are late. Traffic on Interstate 81 is a nightmare this time of evening." Colonel Robert Miller walked in, his wife Martha right beside him. He was not wearing his dress uniform. He wore a simple navy blazer and a crisp white shirt without a tie. But clothes do not hide 30 years of infantry command. He walked with his shoulders rolled back, his steps heavy and deliberate. His eyes immediately scanned the room left to right, assessing the perimeter before locking onto the people. It was the undeniable presence of a man used to giving orders that kept people alive. My father practically vaulted out of his chair. He lunged forward with a wide, desperate smile. He looked pathetic. A blue-collar caterer trying way too hard to impress country club money. "Robert, Martha. So glad you made it. Please sit." Lawrence fumbled aggressively, pulling out chairs at the head of the table. Robert smiled. A polite, practiced civilian smile. He shook Lawrence's hand, nodded at Kyle, and then his eyes continued down the table. They stopped on me. I did not stand up to greet him. I was sitting at the far end of the oak table. My back was perfectly straight. My chin was parallel to the floor. I did not offer a fake wide smile like my father. 4 seconds. That was exactly how long our eyes locked. In the civilian world, 4 seconds of eye contact is just an awkward pause. In the military, it is a full diagnostic check. I watched a micro-expression flash across Robert's face. The corner of his left eye tightened. His brow dipped a fraction of an inch. Recognition, confusion, and then a sudden cold calculation. 3 years ago, the parade field at Fort Campbell. The sun was burning the back of my neck. I was standing in a line of 20 officers. Robert Miller walked down that line, stopped in front of me, and pinned the commendation medal onto the breast of my dress blues. I gave him a single sharp nod that day. Right now, sitting in this dim, red-lit dining room in a cheap black dress, I gave him that exact same nod. Robert gave a nearly imperceptible nod back. He did not say a word. He did not expose me. He allowed Lawrence to aggressively usher him to the head of the table. The psychological chessboard was set. The waitstaff moved in quietly, setting down crystal glasses and plates of iced shrimp cocktail. The room was mostly quiet, filled only with the sharp metallic clink of silver forks hitting porcelain plates. Martha Miller did not just sit there looking pretty. You do not survive 30 years as an army wife by being decorative. She was sharp. She had the kind of eyes that could spot a liar from across a crowded room. She took a slow sip of her ice water, placed the glass down, and turned her attention directly to the other side of the table. "So, Lawrence," Martha said, her voice light, airy, and casually lethal. "What does your oldest daughter do for a living?" My father did not even miss a beat. He swallowed his shrimp and wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. "Ellen manages hotels," he said loudly, waving his hand dismissively in my direction. "She bounces around a lot, one city to the next, never really settles down." He tossed the words onto the table like dirty rags. He made it sound like I was a high school dropout working the night shift at a roadside motel. I looked down at the bright red shrimp sitting on the crushed ice in front of me. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on the back of my neck. I was sitting 10 feet away from the commander, who praised my ability to keep his men alive, and I was being forced to wear the skin of a complete failure. If you have ever had to sit in silence while your family completely lied about your accomplishments just to make themselves look better, you know exactly how heavy that silence feels. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment saying, "I know that feeling." Let me know I'm not the only one who had to bite my tongue to keep the peace. Martha did not let it go. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Hotels?" she asked, her eyes locking onto mine. "That is interesting. Where are you based out of right now, Ellen?" At the head of the table, Colonel Miller stopped chewing. He did not look at me, but his posture shifted. He was listening. I slowly raised my head. I looked right past my father's glaring, threatening eyes and looked directly at Martha. I kept my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Flat, precise. "I am currently based out of Kentucky, ma'am," I said. "It is a high-stress environment. I handle a lot of large-scale logistics, supply chain management, mostly moving heavy resources in and out of unstable areas." Lawrence panicked. He lunged his entire upper body across the table, grabbing the silver breadbasket with both hands. He shoved it violently toward the center of the table, physically cutting off the line of sight between Martha and me. "Try the sourdough, Martha. It is fantastic here." He practically yelled, his face turning a blotchy red. It was a clumsy, desperate move, and it was too late. I dropped my hands into my lap under the table. My fingers found the pocket of the black dress. I gripped the heavy metal challenge coin so hard the edges bit into my palm. At the far end of the table, Colonel Miller slowly lowered his water glass. The ice cubes clinked softly against the crystal. He reached inside the breast pocket of his navy blazer and pulled out his smartphone. He dropped his hand below the edge of the oak table, keeping the screen hidden from Lawrence. His thumb started typing. He was running a search. Halfway through the main course, Martha Miller stood up. "Excuse me for a moment," she said politely, laying her linen napkin on the oak table. She walked toward the heavy brass doors leading out to the hallway. My father instantly panicked. He dropped his fork onto his plate. It hit the porcelain with a loud, clumsy clatter. I should check on the wine selection," Lawrence stammered. He pushed his chair back violently and practically ran out the door to tail her. He looked exactly like a prison guard chasing down an inmate who knew too much. I sat still. I did not turn my head to watch him leave. I just analyzed the tactical situation. Out in that dim hallway, Martha was going to run an interrogation. Lawrence was going to dig his own grave by complaining about his hotel manager daughter who had zero ambition. He was going to use me to make Kyle look like the golden child. What Lawrence did not understand was that lying to a seasoned army wife is as pointless as trying to sneak a loaded weapon through airport security. With Lawrence gone, the table dynamic shifted. Kyle saw an opening. He leaned forward. The overwhelming scent of his cheap, musky cologne rolled across the table, masking the smell of the grilled steaks. He locked his eyes onto Colonel Miller. "So, sir," Kyle started, his voice dripping with forced enthusiasm, "I wanted to talk to you about the new insurance firm I am starting up." Robert did not look up. He kept his eyes on his plate. He used a heavy silver knife to cut a piece of ribeye. Scrape. Scrape. The serrated edge grinding against the plate was the only response. Kyle took the silence as an invitation. "The military market is actually a huge target demographic for us right now. I have been putting together specialized coverage packages for active duty families. I just feel extreme empathy for the struggles of the American soldier, you know. It is a tough life out there." I gripped my fork. The metal handle dug painfully into the meat of my palm. Extreme empathy. I stared at Kyle's perfectly styled hair and his clean, uncalloused hands. Hours ago, this exact same man texted me ordering me to keep my mouth shut. He told me that my military service was an embarrassment, that my life was a dirty topic that made decent people uncomfortable. And now here he was, leaning across the table using the exact same military he was so ashamed of to hustle an insurance policy. He was shamelessly trying to monetize the blood of the uniform he just ordered me to hide. I am the only person sitting at this table who has actually seen an American soldier bleed out on a canvas stretcher in the middle of a desert. And I was being forced to sit in silence while a cowardly civilian used their ghosts to make a sales pitch. Colonel Miller finally stopped cutting his steak. He put the knife down. He picked up his crystal water glass, took a slow drink, and set it back on the coaster. He looked at Kyle. It was the exact same look an eagle gives a rat right before it breaks its spine. "Is that right?" Robert said. His voice was low, gravelly. "Tell me, Kyle, how much do you actually know about military life?" Kyle puffed out his chest, oblivious to the crosshairs painted directly on his forehead. "Well, sir, I read a lot of deployment reports. I follow the news closely. I understand the logistical stress these guys are under when they rotate overseas." "Logistical stress," Robert repeated. He turned his head slightly. His cold gray eyes bypassed Kyle entirely and locked directly onto me. He stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds. Then he looked back at Kyle. "Reading reports is a nice start." Robert said, his tone dropping the polite civilian act completely. "But experience is better. You cannot sell a lifeline if you have never been in the water." Kyle opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The fake smile cracked. He slowly leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking very small inside his expensive suit. The heavy brass doors swung open. Martha walked back into the room. Lawrence trailed behind her, looking slightly out of breath and completely flustered. His tie was crooked. He had clearly failed whatever damage control he just attempted in the hallway. Martha did not return to her seat next to her husband. She walked around the table. She pulled out the heavy oak chair right next to me and sat down. She picked up her coffee cup and stirred it slowly. The silver spoon clinked softly against the ceramic rim. She did not look at Lawrence. She did not look at Kyle. She turned her head and looked directly into my eyes. The polite country club facade was completely gone. Her eyes were hard, sad, beautifully ruthless. They were the eyes of a woman who had spent 30 years sitting up at 3 in the morning, waiting for a casualty notification officer to knock on her front door. She lowered her voice. It was barely above a whisper, meant only for me. "You mentioned combat logistics earlier," Martha said, her eyes scanning my posture. "And you are sitting with the exact posture of someone who was forced to lock their spine straight 10,000 times by a drill sergeant." She stopped stirring her coffee. She set the spoon down. "You are military, aren't you, Ellen?" I did not hesitate. I did not look over at Lawrence. I opened my hand. I let my silver fork drop onto the porcelain plate. Clink! The safety was off. Martha Miller did not blink. She kept her eyes locked entirely on me. There was a profound sense of understanding in her gaze. It was completely opposite to the harsh, hypercritical stare Lawrence used to keep me in line. She was offering me a lifeline. All I had to do was grab it. I looked down at the silver fork resting on my porcelain plate. I took a slow, deep breath. The suffocating air of the burst grill felt suddenly crisp. "Ma'am," I said. My voice was low, but it carried the distinct, sharp edge of absolute authority. "I am not going to lie to you. I am a captain in the Quartermaster Corps, United States Army." Martha inhaled sharply. It was a fast, almost violent intake of air. The delicate porcelain coffee cup in her hand jerked. Coffee sloshed over the rim, staining the white saucer brown. She slowly turned her head. She looked all the way down the long oak table past the flower centerpieces, right at Lawrence. He was completely oblivious. He was laughing loudly at some joke, aggressively cutting into his steak, acting like the king of the castle. Martha turned back to me. The warmth in her eyes was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated fury. "And your family introduced you as a hotel manager?" she asked. Her words hissed out through clenched teeth. "Yes," I replied. Cold, factual. Martha did not ask another question. She did not offer pity. She stood up. The wooden legs of her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She walked fast, her heels clicking aggressively against the wood floor surrounding the red carpet. She went straight to the head of the table, leaned down, and whispered directly into Colonel Miller's ear. Under the table, Robert's phone screen was still glowing. On it were 4 archived military photos. The main image was a close-up shot from the Fort Campbell parade field. A younger, sunburned version of me standing at rigid attention while Robert pinned the commendation medal onto my uniform. Robert closed his eyes. The muscles in his jaw visibly bulged. He locked the phone screen and slid it into his pocket. He picked up his wine glass. He grabbed his heavy silver dinner knife. Clink, clink, clink. He struck the crystal glass 3 times. The sound was sharp, deafening. It cut through the jazz music and the low chatter like a sniper round. The private room went completely dead silent. Every single head snapped toward the head of the table. "I would like to propose a toast," Robert said. His voice was no longer the polite, casual tone of a future father-in-law. It was the deep, booming command of a colonel taking control of a chaotic battlefield. Lawrence instantly dropped his fork. A massive, arrogant grin split across his face. He sat up straighter, adjusting his tie, fully expecting a glowing speech about his wonderful son and their newly merged families. Robert did not look at Kyle. He did not look at Sarah. He looked at Lawrence. He stepped away from the head of the table. He did not raise his glass. Instead, he began to walk. Slow, heavy, deliberate. His leather shoes thudded against the floorboards. He walked right past Kyle. Lawrence panicked. The arrogant smile vanished. He half stood gripping the edge of the table. "Robert, wait. The kids are up here at this end." Robert ignored him completely. He kept walking until he reached the far end of the long table. He stopped right behind my chair. He turned his head and glared down the length of the table directly at Lawrence. "Who is she? To them?" Robert roared. The question detonated in the quiet room. It was not a request for information. It was an execution. Lawrence flinched so hard he knocked his water glass over. Ice and water spilled across the white linen tablecloth. He jumped up from his chair, his hands shaking in front of him. She is my daughter," Lawrence stammered. His voice was a high-pitched, pathetic squeak. She does." Robert raised his left hand. A single flat palm facing Lawrence. It was an absolute demand for silence. Lawrence choked on his own words and shut his mouth. Robert looked down at me. "Captain, state your name and your unit for the room." I pushed my chair back. The wood screeched against the floor. I stood up. I did not slouch. I did not make myself small to accommodate the fragile egos in the room. I squared my shoulders. I lifted my chin. I shed the cheap black dress and the ghost they tried to turn me into. "Captain Ellen Marine," I announced, my voice bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. "3rd Logistics Battalion, Fort Campbell." Robert turned his burning gaze back to Lawrence. He drove the final nail into the coffin. "I personally pinned a medal on this woman's chest," Robert said. His voice shook with barely contained rage. "She managed the main supply routes under heavy direct mortar fire in Helmand. She kept American soldiers alive. And tonight her own biological father introduced her to me as some unemployed drifter." Lawrence turned into a statue. The blood completely drained from his face. His mouth hung open slightly, but no sound came out. At the other end of the table, Kyle stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Sarah looked at Kyle with pure disgust. The fake blue-collar kingdom Lawrence spent 14 years building just collapsed into dust. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and brutally final. Lawrence could not take it. He could not handle the humiliating, dissecting stare of the colonel he so desperately wanted to impress. He stumbled backward. His hip caught the edge of his chair, knocking it over. He turned his back on the table, practically ran to the side door, and disappeared into the dim hallway. The execution was over, but I was not done. I pushed my chair all the way under the table. I turned around and walked toward the side door. The heavy brass door clicked shut behind me, completely cutting off the noise of the private dining room. Behind that thick wood panel, the room was in a state of absolute shock. Kyle's civilian friends were whispering in hushed, panicked tones. Sarah was staring at her fiancé like she had just realized she was marrying a stranger. The fake country club kingdom was in ruins. I stepped into the dim, red-lit hallway. I did not follow my father out here to comfort him. I did not follow him to offer a warm hug or a shoulder to cry on. I followed him because a commanding officer always verifies a confirmed kill on the battlefield. I wanted to see exactly what the dictator of Brambleton Avenue looked like when his armor was finally stripped off. Lawrence was backed against the far wall. He was slumped, his expensive tailored gray suit jacket riding up his shoulders awkwardly. He looked like a cornered stray dog. His chest heaved violently. Ha! 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 The harsh, ragged sound of his breathing bounced off the velvet-lined walls. Sweat beaded thick on his forehead, catching the low, flickering light of the wall sconces. The smell of his peppermint chewing gum was completely overpowered by the sour, sharp stench of pure panic. I stopped 10 feet away. I locked my knees. I crossed my arms behind my back. Parade rest. I just stood there in the shadows and watched him hyperventilate. Robert does not get it, Lawrence gasped out. He choked on his own saliva, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched scrape. He does not understand a damn thing. You walked out on this family. You picked the army over me. He raised his hands. They were shaking. Massive, calloused hands that could cleave through solid bone with a heavy meat chopper were trembling like dry leaves in the wind. He reached inside the breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out his wallet. It did not match the expensive suit. It was a thick, ugly chunk of cheap brown leather. The edges were heavily frayed, the stitching blown out and repaired with thick thread years ago. It was the wallet of a blue-collar caterer desperately clinging to a man trying to play the part of the country club elite. Lawrence dug 2 thick fingers into a hidden fold behind the cash slot. His hands shook so badly he dropped a plastic credit card onto the carpet. He ignored it. He pulled out a small rectangular piece of paper. It was a photograph. The edges were heavily yellowed and crumbling. Dust and dry paper flakes drifted down to the red carpet as he gripped it. I did not need to step closer to know what it was. I had seen it once, maybe twice, in my entire life. It was a picture of a woman in a crisp white 1960s nurse uniform. My grandmother. The woman who packed a single suitcase and walked out the front door when my father was exactly 11 years old. She never called. She never came back. She just left. Lawrence sobbed. An actual chest-heaving sob ripped out of his throat. A grown man crying in the shadows of a steakhouse hallway. His broad shoulders violently shook. She just packed her bag and left me. And she had that exact same dead, stubborn stare in her eyes. The exact same look you have. He looked up from the crumbling paper. His eyes were red, watery, and completely broken. When you got in that taxi 14 years ago, he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of a half-century of anger. When that heavy car door slammed shut, it was her all over again. I saw her looking right back at me. The air in the hallway turned into solid concrete. The truth finally crawled out of the dark. The tactical map of the last 14 years instantly rearranged itself in my head. It was never about the uniform. It was never about the danger of the combat zones, the improvised explosives on the supply routes, or the jagged shrapnel that tore open my right shoulder. He did not hate the United States Army. He did not hate my rank. He hated that I had the spine to leave him. He used 14 years of psychological warfare on his own flesh and blood. He systematically stripped my rank, erased my identity, and tried to force me into the mold of a pathetic, unemployed failure. He did not do it to protect me from the horrors of war. He did it to punish a ghost. He used me as a convenient punching bag for a 50-year-old wound he was too much of a coward to stitch up. He was terrified of being abandoned, so he tried to crush my legs to make sure I could never walk away. I stared at the tears rolling down his cheeks. I waited for the empathy to kick in. I waited for the daughter inside me to feel a shred of pity for the wounded 11-year-old boy trapped inside that expensive gray suit. Nothing happened. My chest was a hollow, empty drum. I have held the hands of 19-year-old kids missing limbs. I have watched real men bleed out in the dirt without shedding a single tear, holding onto their dignity until their lungs stopped working entirely. I had absolutely no sympathy left for a grown man who chose to torture his own child rather than deal with his own baggage. "So you did everything you could to tear me down," I said. My voice was completely dry, like heavy boots grinding on gravel. "You tried to erase me. You tried to make sure I was such a massive failure that I would have nowhere else to go. You wanted me trapped in your kitchen forever." Lawrence flinched. He looked down at the crumbling paper in his hands. He refused to meet my eyes. He did not deny it. He just stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the ghost of the nurse who broke him. I did not wait for an apology. I did not ask for a confession. This psychological war was over. I was not his therapist. I was not his emotional dumping ground. I was not going to carry the heavy, rotting weight of his unhealed trauma for another single second of my life. I turned my back on him. I walked directly toward the heavy brass door of the private dining room. I reached out, grabbed the cold metal handle, and pushed it open. The bright crimson light spilled out into the dark hallway, cutting through the shadows. I stepped through the frame, leaving him entirely alone in the dark with his ghosts. It was time to claim my final piece of honor. I pushed the heavy brass door open and walked back into the crimson light of the private dining room. Lawrence shuffled in a few seconds behind me. He did not look like the arrogant king of the table anymore. He looked like an empty, hollowed-out shell. He dragged his feet across the thick velvet carpet, pulled out his heavy oak chair, and collapsed into it. He slumped forward, dropping his chin toward his chest, his eyes glued to a spilled water stain on the white linen tablecloth. At the head of the table, Colonel Robert Miller was still standing. The room was completely paralyzed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Robert reached down and picked up his crystal wine glass by the stem. "I would like to finish my toast," Robert said. His voice was low, rolling across the room with the absolute, unquestionable authority of a battlefield commander. He did not look at Kyle. He did not look at the bride. He kept his eyes fixed directly on my father. Tonight I learned two things. Robert continued, the glass held steady in his hand. First, I learned that there is a brilliant, highly decorated military officer sitting at this table, a woman who has sacrificed her own blood to keep my soldiers alive. Robert paused. The silence in the room was deafening. And second, Robert's voice dropped an octave, turning into pure, freezing steel. I learned that there is a father sitting at this table who is perfectly willing to erase his own child's sacrifices just to protect his own fragile ego. Lawrence flinched. He shrank further down into his chair, trying to disappear into the expensive upholstery. "The only true embarrassment in this room tonight," Robert said, delivering the final fatal blow, "is a man stripping the hard-earned honor from his own flesh and blood." He lowered the glass. He did not take a sip. Across the table, Sarah slowly turned her head. She looked at Kyle. The naive, polite smile was entirely gone. She looked at her fiancé with pure, unfiltered disgust. She finally saw the coward hiding inside the tailored suit. Robert stepped away from the head of the table. He walked over to me. He stopped, squared his broad shoulders, and extended his right hand. "Captain Morin," Robert said, looking me dead in the eye, "you deserve to be honored tonight, not hidden." I reached out and gripped his hand. His palm was rough, calloused, and firm. It was the fiery, unbreakable handshake of a soldier. It was the exact kind of respect I'd spent 14 years bleeding for, completely freely given by a man who actually understood the heavy cost of the uniform. Martha stepped up right behind her husband. She reached out and placed a warm hand on my shoulder. She squeezed it gently. The heavy maternal weight of that simple touch sent a sharp, burning sting straight up the bridge of my nose. I swallowed hard. I did not cry. An officer holds the line. I let go of Robert's hand. I turned slowly to my right and looked down at Lawrence. He was staring at his empty plate. He looked old, tired, defeated. The dictator of the kitchen was dead. I reached my hand deep into the pocket of the cheap black silk dress he forced me to wear. My fingers brushed past the synthetic fabric and closed tightly around the solid, heavy brass of the challenge coin. I pulled it out. The metal was ice cold against my skin. The raised edges of the battalion crest caught the dim crimson light of the chandelier overhead. I held the coin over the table, right next to Lawrence's dinner plate. I opened my fingers. Clack! The heavy brass hit the polished oak wood with a sharp, dry crack. The metallic sound echoed in the quiet room. Lawrence jumped at the noise. He slowly turned his head and stared at the coin. "A gift from the colonel," I said. My voice was smooth, quiet, and sharper than a combat knife. "Keep it." Lawrence looked up at me, his eyes wide, watery, and completely lost. "The next time you want to introduce me to someone," I said, leaning down just a fraction of an inch, "I want you to look at that piece of metal and remember exactly who I am." I did not wait for him to respond. He had no words left anyway. I stood up straight. I used both hands to smooth down the wrinkles in the front of my black dress. I did not look at Kyle. I did not say a single word to my brother. I just turned my back on the entire Moran family. I walked with long, deliberate, heavy strides. I pushed the main double doors open and walked straight out of the purse grill. I stepped out the heavy glass front doors of the restaurant and out into the night. The parking lot was dark. The crisp, freezing wind coming off the Virginia mountains hit my face. It smelled like raw pine needles, old asphalt, and the sharp scent of car exhaust. I took a massive breath. My lungs expanded, filling with the cold air. The suffocating pressure in my chest was completely gone. I heard the heavy restaurant doors bang open behind me. Fast, panicked footsteps slapped against the concrete pavement. "Ellen, wait. Come on," Kyle yelled. His voice was whiny, desperate. "You completely ruined the whole night. You could have just stayed quiet." I stopped walking. I turned around. Kyle was jogging toward me, his tie loose, looking completely pathetic. I did not yell. I just raised my right hand palm facing him. A hard, non-negotiable stop. He froze in his tracks. "When you finally figure out how to accept who I actually am," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the cold night air, "you know exactly where to find me. Fort Campbell, Kentucky." I let my hand drop to my side. "If you cannot do that," I said, "then goodbye, Kyle." I turned around, walked to my rental car, and unlocked the door. The hinges creaked as I pulled it open. I slid into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy door shut. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I clicked the headlights on. The bright white beams sliced right through the dark parking lot, illuminating the exit. As I put the car into drive, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. The screen lit up the dark cabin. It was a text message from an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. "Our family will always have a seat at the table for you. Drive safe, Captain. Martha." I stared at the glowing letters. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. 14 years of being locked in a psychological prison. 14 years of begging for a scrap of respect from a bloodline that only wanted to use me. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. The car pulled out onto the empty highway, accelerating into the absolute freedom of the dark Virginia night. I was finally heading home. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next video.